Richard John Wershe was born on July 18, 1969, to Richard Wershe Sr. and Darlene McCormick. The lower middle-class family lived in a predominantly African-American eastside neighborhood, about 7 miles from downtown Detroit, that was also home to John and Leonard Curry. When Rick was 6 years old, his mother, Darlene, left the family. Richard Sr. made a living buying and selling firearms, including semi-automatic handguns and submachine guns. He would eventually manage a gun store located in downtown Detroit. When Rick was 8 years old, his father taught him how to fire a gun and started taking him to gun shows at Detroit's Light Guard Armory. He later gave him his own .22 caliber rifle. When Rick was 13, the neighborhood became one of several casualties of white flight, owing to the decline of the city's auto industry and its accompanying layoffs. Rick's first arrest took place on March 24, 1984. After pulling into a gas station near his home, the car that Rick was driving, his grandmother's, was stolen while he was inside buying a soda. After being alerted by Dawn, who'd driven another car to the station and was blowing the horn, Rick got into Dawn's vehicle and the two pursued the thief on I-94. Rick fired 2 shots from the .22 caliber revolver Dawn kept in her purse, and unfortunately for him, an off-duty police officer was in the car next to them and subsequently pulled Dawn over. But as luck would have it, the officer failed to appear at trial, leading to the charges being dropped. At 14 years old, Wershe began his career as a confidential informant. Then, he was recruited by the FBI, because of his familiarity with members of the Curry Brothers, a drug trafficking organization, who were under investigation by the Bureau. To conceal the fact that they were using a juvenile to gather intelligence, the agents unofficially hired him in June of 1984 and used the same codename, Jem, that they'd given to his father, who had already been an informant for some time. Initially, his role was limited to identifying the names of individuals in photos shown to him by the FBI. Rick would often attend meetings with FBI agent James Dixon in the parking lot of a church near Livernois Avenue for debriefings. In February of 1985, investigators used Rick's intel to secure a warrant to search a home, in which they seized $200,000 in cash. His duties quickly escalated to making drug buys for the Detroit police, including Officer Billy Jasper. Rick's payment for helping the authorities would sometimes run as much as $2,000 per job, in cash. Johnny Curry sometimes took Rick along to watch the Detroit Tigers play. He even accompanied the Currys to a World Middleweight Championship boxing bout, held on April 15, 1985 in Las Vegas, Nevada. The FBI gave him $1,500 to pay for expenses during the trip. During a shooting targeting the home of Leon Lucas, his 13-year-old nephew, Damian Lucas, was inadvertently killed by 3 Curry triggermen after being shot in the chest. Lucas, who was a Curry associate, had been given the responsibility of arranging the itinerary but was unable to purchase tickets to the fight ahead of time. The shooting was intended to be a message to Lucas, who wasn't home at the time. Following 13-year-old Damian's killing, Johnny Curry reportedly held an organization meeting in the basement of his home, during which he offered to pay anyone who was in the know to keep quiet about the matter if questioned by police. Wershe reported that he'd personally attended the meeting. He also informed the FBI of Detroit Police Homicide Inspector Gilbert Hill, in his successful efforts to direct the investigation of Damian's murder away from the Curry brothers. Wershe was a passenger in Johnny Curry's car when he heard homicide detective Hill and John Curry discussing the matter during a speakerphone conversation on the car phone. Hill, who appeared as Inspector Todd in the Beverly Hills Cop film trilogy, and was later elected president of Detroit City Council, died in February of 2016. Rick eventually started selling cocaine himself, buying 8 balls and crack from the Currys to be resold. He began amassing a circle of 15 or so drug-dealing friends as well. When he was 15, another Curry associate accidentally shot Rick in the stomach, in his home, with a .357 caliber handgun. The wound required hospitalization and the use of a colostomy bag for a time, even after his release. In June of 1986, law enforcement dropped Wershe, who'd left school in the 9th grade following his shooting, as an informant, and he resumed selling cocaine without their oversight. He was supplied by local drug kingpin Arthur Derrick, whom he met through the Curry brothers. Derrick owned a fleet of 4 planes, 2 of which he purchased from the Rolling Stones, which he used to fly product in from Miami, netting $100,000 profit per day at his peak. Rick would sometimes accompany Derek to Miami, where he'd reserve half of a floor at the Hilton and procure the services of escorts. Derek, who died in 2005, lived in a palatial home with a marble-floored basement and a pool bearing his initials on the bottom. Rick made connections of his own in Miami and began receiving 50-kilogram shipments from his new supplier. Around that time, Rick followed in his father's footsteps and became a small-time arms dealer as well. He would buy guns from Ohio state troopers he met at a gun show and resell them back in Detroit. That September, Rick made a $1,600 cocaine sale to an undercover DEA agent at his childhood home. Rick moved out of his father's home again, when Wershe Sr. discovered and confiscated a shoe box containing $50,000 in cash under his bed. In 1987, he began a romantic relationship with Johnny Curry's wife, Kathy, who was 7 years his senior. Kathy's father, Willie Volsan, had himself been a gambling racketeer turned heroin distributor in the 1970s. Kathy used her familial relationship to her uncle, Detroit Mayor Coleman Young, to gain access to information regarding police investigations involving herself and those in her circle. In fact, where she was on hand when federal agents conducted a raid on her townhouse in June of 1987, and discovered reports prepared by Detroit narcotics officers and a list of unlisted telephone numbers belonging to several high-ranking members of Detroit police personnel. That same year, Rick was targeted in an unsuccessful shooting while riding in the passenger seat of a friend's convertible. While the two were stopped at a red light, a van pulled up beside them. The sliding door opened and the two were only saved from the gunfire that followed because they ran the light. On May 22, 1987, at about 9 p.m., Wershe was arrested when police found him in possession of 8 kilograms of cocaine and thousands of dollars in cash. He was stopped by police, including Officer Rodney Grandison, whom he recognized. When the officers spotted a Kroger grocery bag full of cash on the floor of the car, Wershe, who had been riding in the passenger seat, initiated a scuffle with one of the cops. After both his father, Rick Sr., and Dawn came outside and joined the small crowd of onlookers, Rick's father grabbed the bag and gave it to Dawn, who ran to her grandparents' home across the street. The officers, who'd pursued Dawn, discovered the bag of cash in a linen closet. Though the police reported the amount as $30,000, Wershe later testified that the arresting officers seized $34,000. That same night, police also located a cardboard box containing 8 kilograms of cocaine that, according to an anonymous tip, Rick had hidden under a neighbor's porch. Rick was charged with possession of intent to deliver less than 50 grams of cocaine, and possession with intent to deliver more than 650 grams of cocaine. He was granted bail in the amount of $250,000 for the first charge, and $750,000 for the second. On September 12, an associate of Rick's, Steve Roussel, was murdered when a best friends gang enforcer shot him to death as he slept. In October, Rick was arrested again near the Royal Skateland rink and charged with possession of 5 kilograms of cocaine. He was arraigned on October 14, 1987 and again granted bail. On October 27, federal agents and members of the Detroit Police Department executed a search warrant on Rick Sr.'s home, where they seized weapons, ammunition, $2,000 in cash from a safe, and parts for gun silencers. Law enforcement then proceeded to execute a search warrant on Rick's home, which was located across the street from his mother's. It was there that 5 gun barrels, that fit the silencer parts, were found on a bed and seized. Rick's fingerprints were later matched to those found on 7 of the silencers. Prior to his trial, Agent Groman met with the family at a hotel, and offered assistance on behalf of the government in exchange for Rick's testimony against prominent drug traffickers. Fearing for his life, Rick declined the offer. Rick's trial at the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice in downtown Detroit began in January of 1988. Witnesses testified that Wershe had been pistol-whipped by the officers during his scuffle with the police. The jury deliberated for 4 days and deadlocked twice before agreeing to a guilty verdict. On January 15, 1988, Rick was convicted of 1 count of possession with intent to deliver more than 650 grams of a substance containing cocaine. By the time he was convicted, Rick was the father of 2 young girls. Richard Sr. granted interviews to journalists, in which he revealed his family's informant history, while incarcerated in the Wayne County Jail. the FBI refused to corroborate Richard Sr. assertions, citing agency confidentiality policy. On February 4, Rick was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, which was the mandatory sentence for the conviction under Michigan law at the time. On April 22, 1988, Richard Sr. was convicted of possession of 23 silencers. He was given a 7.5-year sentence and charged a $50 fine. In an attempt to gain leniency, Rick cooperated with a 1990 FBI investigation of Detroit police officers, who were participating in the shipment of drugs to Detroit City Airport. He had been approached by his former FBI handler, Agent Groman, in July while incarcerated, largely due to the Bureau's suspicions that leaks within the Detroit Police Department, which had compromised FBI investigations, were attributable to Kathy Curry and Sergeant James Harris. Rick's involvement in the 8-month sting included introducing Miami drug supplier Mike Diaz to Kathy Volsan Curry, who often visited him via Dawn, who had dinner with the two of them on July 26. Kathy in turn introduced Diaz to her father, Willie Clyde Volsan, who happened to be married to Mayor Young's sister. Unbeknownst to the Volsans, Diaz was actually undercover FBI agent Mike Castro, and he'd recorded his conversations with them. Castro's fellow agents even stole Volsan's Cadillac from a parking lot in order to plant listening devices inside, before returning it. Volsan connected Castro with police officers, who agreed to provide security for Diaz's cash and 100-kilogram cocaine shipments, which they did on at least 5 occasions. Willie Volsan, Kathy Curry, and 4 others were arrested on May 21, 1991, on charges of accepting money for protecting narcotics trafficking. The following day, 11 police officers were arraigned on federal charges of illegally providing protection for narcotics trafficking, and released on bail. Harris had accepted $50,000, while most of the other cops took $3,000 per flight. In June, however, the charges against Kathy and the 11 police officers were dropped to allow the government more time to investigate. Eventually, Harris was sentenced to 30 years in prison, Willie Volsan was sentenced to 19 years and 5 months, and Young was given 2 years and 6 months. Rick's assistance resulted in his admittance into the Federal Witness Protection Program by the Justice Department, and he was transferred to a medium-security prison in Marianna, Florida. Kathy's charges were subsequently dropped. In August of 1991, Richard Sr. was paroled after serving 3 years in prison for his weapons conviction. On March 11, 1992, he was arrested outside of his home by U.S. Marshals for violating parole by not filing monthly activity reports, a condition of his parole. A month earlier, Dawn Wershe, who lived with him along with her 3 children, had accused her father of assaulting her. She told police that he'd struck her following her return home after a 3-day absence, in which he was left to care for her children with no knowledge of her whereabouts. Consequently, white boy Rick was granted his first parole hearing on March 27, 2003. In 2006, Wershe was convicted for racketeering involving a car theft ring, while in prison in Florida. After a good deal in Auto Trader magazine caught his eye, Rick gave the Miami car dealer's contact information to his sister, Dawn, who was raising his daughter, and urged her to call. The idea was that she'd resell the car in Detroit for a profit, since, ironically, auto prices are higher in the Motor City. Rick also passed the dealer's information on to fellow inmate, whose son in Virginia needed a car. Dawn earned a profit of at least $6,000 from the sale of 4 cars. However, the vehicles turned out to be stolen, with altered VIN numbers used to defraud Florida officials into issuing new titles. Rick's role was discovered during a 2-year criminal investigation. Rick's plea agreement included the provision that charges not be filed against his sister Dawn, nor his mother. After pleading guilty to racketeering, Rick Wershe received a 5-year prison sentence, though he received credit for 488 days. Rick Wershe was expelled from the Witness Protection Program as a result of his conviction. Rick's father, Richard Sr., died in 2014. Rick was given a parole hearing in June of 2017, which took place at the correctional facility in Jackson, Michigan. During the proceedings, Rick, wearing a blue and orange prison-issue uniform, was questioned by the state attorney for over 4 hours. On July 14, 2017, the Michigan Parole Board's 10 members voted unanimously to release Rick Wershe. On July 20, 2020, he was released from custody in Florida, having completed his sentence with credits for good behavior. He now has 3 children and 6 grandchildren.